Tonight on Primetime Politics, hitting the brakes. Donald Trump reverses course on the tariffs put into place Tuesday, saying most Canadian and Mexican products will not have to deal with them for 30 days. Coming up, we'll speak to the president of Unifor and the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association to discuss how all this uncertainty is already affecting the Canadian economy. And our political strategist on how Trump is also affecting Canada's choices for next Prime Minister. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. The unpredictability of the Trump White House was once again on full display today. On Tuesday, it was a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican goods. On Wednesday, a 30-day reprieve from those tariffs for the auto sector. And now, on this Thursday, a 30-day reprieve for both Canada and Mexico on products covered under CUSMA. And this is the response we received from the finance minister today, Dominic LeBlanc, stating the United States has agreed to suspend tariffs on CUSMA-compliant exports from Canada until April the 2nd. As a result, Canada will not proceed with the second wave of tariffs on $125 billion of U.S. products until April the 2nd, while we continue to work for the removal of all tariffs. Now, important to note, Ottawa is not withdrawing, nor is it suspending the first tranche of Canadian counter tariffs. So those duties affecting $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, well, they will stand. Let's bring into the conversation now Brian Kingston. He is the president and the CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Brian, good to see you. Thank you for joining the program.
Thanks for having me on.
So a big reversal this afternoon from the White House. What do you think has led the president to this decision?
Well, I think a couple of things have happened. I think, first of all, there is a recognition of how deeply integrated the automotive industry is across North America. We've been making that case for years. And if you look at how much trade goes back and forth across the border and how much U.S. content is in Canadian-built vehicles, any tariff action is damaging to the United States. Of course, it damages Canada, but it damages the United States. And so I think that has been understood. And while the reprieve that we've been given is short term, I am hopeful that this translates into a longer reprieve, given how integrated this sector is and important it is for the U.S. economy.
Well, certainly it's been hard to predict where the White House is actually going to go with all this stuff. Although, if you listen to the White House press secretary yesterday, she was very clear. For her administration, for the Trump administration, this reprieve, and in particular for the auto sector, it's about getting production back into the United States. So what are you hearing from your members about that? Are they considering pulling up stakes and going south of the border?
No, absolutely not. And look, if you look at the investment picture across North America, since the USMCA was signed, or the CUSMA agreement in 2020, which was negotiated, of course, by President Trump, there's been $288 billion in new automotive investment into the continent. The overwhelming majority of that, 80%, has gone into the United States. So the U.S. benefits the most from this integrated automotive trade market. And I think that that is becoming well understood. The other important factor here, too, is Canada is contemplating retaliating on vehicles. Well, Canada is the most important destination for U.S.-built vehicles by a wide margin. The U.S. sends more cars to Canada than it sends to China, Germany, and Mexico combined. So while I understand the desire to bring more investment into the United States, Canada is important to the U.S. as a market and as a manufacturing jurisdiction. So I remain confident in the footprint here and in the future of the sector.
So what's your advice then to the federal government? And it's currently, of course, the Prime Minister will be replaced come Sunday. But what's your advice for officials in Ottawa as to how to approach this 30-day period, considering this all began with border concerns?
Well, I think it's clear now that this isn't really about the border. It is really an economic move by the United States. I just think we need to continue to double down on the message around integration and the USMCA. This was a Trump negotiated agreement. It is having the desired effect. Since it's been negotiated, huge amounts of investments have been announced. Most of them have gone into the U.S. If you look at the content in Canadian vehicles, it is very much American. There's huge amounts of American content. So the agreement that they've negotiated is working as intended, and the auto sector cannot be competitive globally if the North American market is diced up into three smaller markets. So we just have to keep making the case and explaining why this is so important to the administration. I think there's a path out of this.
Brian Kingston, thank you for that. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Now, earlier today, I did get a chance to speak with Lana Payne, the president of Unifor, which is this country's largest private sector union. And we began our conversation talking about how the border, as Donald Trump says, fits into these talks, if at all, and why she thinks Canada has to keep hitting hard.
Well, the reality, in my opinion, for Canada is this has never been about the border, and it's never been about fentanyl. It's always been about our jobs and shifting investment and production out of Canada and into the United States. And that's what's at risk right now, which is why it's so important, Michael, that the federal government, the provincial governments continue to do what they're doing, and that's fighting back hard. And our union is going to continue fighting back hard, because this reprieve, so-called reprieve that he's given the auto sector right now in Canada is no reprieve whatsoever.
No reprieve whatsoever. And you know, we did hear it from his White House press secretary saying this, it was really meant to give the companies time to move their facilities to the United States. You know, and to that, when you speak to your members, Lana, I'm wondering what this kind of uncertainty, this back and forth that we've been seeing from the White House in this week alone, whether or not that's created job losses already, or perhaps even warnings that shifts are going to be canceled amongst your members.
Michael, I've just come out of a meeting with 150 of our leaders from the auto sector across Ontario, and I can tell you two things are happening right now. There is an incredible amount of worry and anxiety that workers are feeling. That is being expressed to their local union leadership every single day. And there is incredible resolve among our leadership right now to bring this to a head. No one is going to take this lightly. And I can tell you, any company in Canada where we have people working who thinks that they can move and shift production out of Canada, shift auto production out of Canada to the United States in order to appease Donald Trump is going to have a massive fight on their hands. I can guarantee you that. And our leadership came here today to talk just about that.
Talk about that, and you've also been speaking with the Prime Minister, part of the Advisory Council on the United States and Canada relations. So what has been your advice to the Prime Minister, and given the fact that we're going to get a new leader come this Sunday and a new Prime Minister, what is the advice on the table to them when it comes to the workers in this country?
Well, obviously, we need to hit back hard with the tariffs that we have put out there already. Provinces are hitting back with non-tariff related retaliation. That is also important, but everything has to be on the table, and we need to move quickly. That is what I would say right now. We cannot continue in this holding pattern of taking attack after attack, threat after threat. And for working people, they need to see, obviously, that the government has their back in case we get into a massive trade war. We're going to need workers' supports, and industry is going to need support. The reality is, though, Canada has a ton of leverage, and honestly, we're going to have to use it.
Lana Payne, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, the declarations being made by Donald Trump are not only having an effect here in Canada, they are also affecting Canada's allies, most notably on this Thursday, the European Union, whose leaders gathered for emergency talks in Brussels today. Military spending, ramping that up, and supporting Ukraine, the focus to the meeting. Now that Donald Trump has stopped all aid to Ukraine and halted all intelligence sharing on Russian positions, which until now have been critical in Ukraine's defense.
I present today to the leaders the Rearm Europe plan. The Rearm Europe plan provides up to 800 billion euros for defense investment. It gives the member states fiscal space to invest in defense. It gives the member states possibility to invest in the Ukrainian defense industry or to procure military capabilities that go right away to Ukraine.
Dear Ursula, and I want to thank all our European leaders, first of all, and for such strong support.
Well, Rose Gottemoeller was NATO's Deputy Secretary General from 2016 to 2019. Currently, she is the William J. Perry Lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogoli Institute. Ms. Gottemoeller, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we cannot ignore the fact that this meeting in Brussels today was called essentially because democratic countries around the world are concerned that they can no longer rely on the United States as a dependable partner. What do you make of that assessment, that concern?
It is very concerning. Now, part of what's going on is, I have to say, very, very welcome, and that is Donald Trump during his first term in office, and I was NATO Deputy Secretary General during that period. He was demanding that NATO allies and our allies in Asia spend more on their own defense, and they started to get the message during that period. But now during his second term in office, and he's only been in office a month, but it seems like a very long time, he has really gotten that message driven home. And not only NATO allies in Europe, but also in Canada and of course in Asia as well, have understood that the United States is not going to be bankrolling their defense anymore, and they need to be spending more on their own defense. More concerning, and I think your question points to it, is the notion that the United States is simply withdrawing support for its longtime allied relationships. And this, I think, is concerning to all of us, both experts here in the United States, but also our allies on this continent and abroad.
How difficult is it for you, though, given the position you held with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to hear Donald Trump move closer to Russia, adopt Russian disinformation when it comes to Ukraine, call Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator? How troubling is that to you personally?
Look, Donald Trump is a man who holds grudges for a long period of time, and it's clear that he does not like Zelensky from, as he perceives it, the lack of support that Zelensky gave him for his attempts to go after Joe Biden and his family back in his first period in office. And you may recollect that that led to his first impeachment back in 2018-19. And so he does, I think, not hold a lot of affection for President Zelensky. We saw that on display a week ago in the Oval Office. Putin, on the other hand, he feels like Putin's, one of his kind of guys, obviously, and that is extraordinarily disturbing because he does pick up on Russian talking points and on Russian disinformation. And I find that very, very disturbing indeed. But let me make one more point about Putin. A week ago, right before the disastrous Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, Trump also said publicly on CNN that Putin also had to make some concessions, that he wasn't going to get everything he wanted out of this war either. And so I do think at this point we need to remember that he's trying to get both guys to the negotiating table, and he's made it clear that both guys are going to have to make some concessions.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the meantime, as the talks continue here between the United States and Russia, Europe is talking about creating this peacekeeping force that would move into Ukraine as essentially a security guarantee for the country against any future Russian aggression. How successful would that peacekeeping force be without the United States? Because the security guarantee that Kyiv is looking for from Washington doesn't seem to be forthcoming right now.
Yes, that's very clear that Trump himself is not willing to offer up security guarantees to Ukraine. In fact, he said during that same CNN interview that I gave a moment ago that the Europeans were going to have to guarantee Ukraine's security. So I think that it is good, and we heard that at the EU summit today in Brussels, that the Europeans are stepping forward. More and more European countries are beginning to say that they would be willing to provide forces for this stabilization force or implementation force or peacekeepers, whatever it will be called in the end of the day. But I also took note today that Turkey has said that it would be willing to provide forces for such a stabilization force in Ukraine. And I think that that's very welcome news because Turkey, as you may know, has been one of the most, I would say, stable partners for the Russians as neighbors across the Black Sea, and Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has a pretty good relationship with President Putin. So if the Turks are willing to put forces into Ukraine, I think that is very significant. And furthermore, the Turks are very good in NATO operations. They always have been. In some ways, they are not a reliable ally, but in terms of NATO operations, they have always been extremely reliable. So I think that that's a good sign for the success of such a stabilization force.
So a good sign, as you say. Although, you know, I do want to ask you a question about NATO writ larger, because as you know, Donald Trump has cast doubts about the need for NATO, the efficacy of NATO. We now are seeing some European leaders talking about creating a European alliance that would emerge out of NATO. Will we see the United States withdraw from the alliance? Can the alliance survive without the United States?
I certainly feared that during Trump's election campaign this time around. He threatened it explicitly. The famous quote about Vladimir Putin can do whatever the hell he wants with the NATO alliance. These were all very concerning comments during his election campaign. I have to say, since Trump took office, my concerns about an outright withdrawal from NATO have receded, because he's taken certain steps. For example, among the first of the ambassadors that he named Whitaker, nominated him as a U.S. ambassador to NATO. So to me, that was a sign that actually he expects to continue to be represented at NATO and to work with the NATO allies. Second thing that I think is rather important in this regard is the fact that he had his Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, in that difficult speech he made to the NATO allies right before the Munich Security Conference 2 weeks ago. Hegseth said point blank, "We support NATO and we support European security," full stop. This was a very, very strong statement of support, and it must have been coming directly from the president. Hegseth would not have said something so clear and firm if he had not been acting on the president's guidance. So I do think that they are beginning to make some strong statements of support for NATO now. But, you know, we have to be doubtful about what form it's going to take going forward. Clearly, the president is thinking about moving to the Indo-Pacific, putting more emphasis on Indo-Pacific. This is nothing new. President Obama talked about the pivot to Asia over a decade ago, but maybe removing some troops from Europe. I know that really concerns the allies, moving troops from Europe and pivoting them to Asia. That's going to be very difficult. So we'll have to see what concrete steps the Trump White House is willing to take to continue to support the NATO alliance.
One last question for you, because, you know, when we see all this talk and this almost realignment with the U.S. president being far more effusive with his comments of the Russian president, there is now a fear that we are approaching another world war. Do you see that as a potential in this moment?
I've been very worried about wider global conflict since the Russians launched their second invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, now 3 years ago. So yes, I think we have to be concerned about wider conflict involving both the Russians and the Chinese at this juncture. And it started before Trump returned to office. The thing about the Trump administration and President Trump himself is that he's very mercurial, and you do not know from 1 minute to the next exactly what his decision space is going to be. I just saw the news this morning that, and I know up in Canada, you're gravely concerned about the sanctions that have been imposed, and he's pulled back from sanctions against Mexico just today. So I assume your prime minister is working hard to try to get the same deal for Canada. So, you know, this is a mercurial president, and he's going to be going one direction and the next. And I think the best we can try to do is to continue to remind Washington of where U.S. national interests lie. And to my mind, U.S. national interests lie in having strong alliances and working closely with our allies to secure the peace and secure stability.
Ms. Gottemoeller, thank you for this. I really appreciate the insight and the time today.
My pleasure.
And one more closing note on that last conversation. Ukraine's president says a delegation from his country will meet with U.S. officials next week in Saudi Arabia. Well, uncertainty about global security, uncertainty about the Canadian economy, all tied to Donald Trump and whoever wins next Sunday's Liberal leadership contest and soon after win the federal election will be the person leading this country through those uncharted waters. To talk about this, we're now joined by Susan Smith, former Liberal strategist, co-founder and principal at Blue Sky Strategy Group, Cole Hogan, a conservative digital strategist, now principal at GT, and George Soule, a former director of communications with the federal NDP. Hello to the three of you.
Oh,
so obviously shifting here a bit, the focus that we've had through the program today, and right now focusing on the political contest at play here at home. And to that, I want to start here with a new poll from Leger Marketing, that firm tracking a 5-point gain when it comes to popular support for the Conservative Party, leading the race once again at 43%, a 5-point drop for the Liberals, now at 30%, 33% if they attach Mark Carney's name to the party, the NDP at 13%. And according to the firm, they say the swing can be attributed to emerging doubt about Mark Carney, who has been subjected to these attack ads from the Conservative Party. Those ads leading to questions about his time with Brookfield, his time advising the Prime Minister on economic and environmental policy. Is Mark Carney vulnerable right now, Susan?
Well, he hasn't won the Liberal leadership yet, Michael, but the Conservatives, and I think most of the country, think he will be the likely winner on Sunday. Whomever is going to win, and the Conservatives are worried about it, they're running attack ads against him. I think people are going to pay attention very closely to the election. They're going to pay very close attention. So anybody that is attacked is vulnerable. At the same time, there are other polls showing that Mr. Poilievre's numbers are going down. I think Canadians are starting to inch towards that level of scrutiny before they cast a ballot. The big story still is that that is now a 5-point gap between, according to that poll, between Liberals and Conservatives, and it was a double-digit gap before now. So in about 8 weeks, there's been a massive gap closure there. And the longer Mr. Trump behaves erratically and detrimentally to Canada, the more scrutiny Canadians will put on who will best lead the country. And most of the other polls put the confidence in Mark Carney as a former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, and an economist with real world experience versus Mr. Poilievre, who's a career politician.
Okay, I adore you, but it's actually more than a 5-point gap, although I take your point that things are tightening. Cole, what do you make of the Mark Carney and how vulnerable he is?
Sure. When I look at historical trends, I think, John Turner, when he took over from Pierre Trudeau, got a bump in the polls. Kim Campbell, when she took over from Brian Mulroney, got a bump in the polls. Then they both went down to historical defeats. So I think on the Conservative side, no one expected us to maintain a 20-plus point lead forever. There was going to be some variance here. But now I think, to the point that we're discussing, there's been increased criticism of Mark Carney. He can't just say whatever and get away with it. He's being fact-checked on multiple issues, and Canadians are paying more attention and changing their opinion. So if we look at the last few weeks when he's been caught in, let's call them embellishments or fabrications, this is changing the public's opinion about him, and they're shifting back and taking a closer look and saying, well, we're not quite sure about this guy either. And, Carney, try as he may, he's not having quite as successful of a job separating himself from the Trudeau legacy.
Okay, what do you say to it, George?
Well, I mean, I think a couple things. One, I think for a while, and we've known this, was there were a bunch of people who were anybody but Trudeau who were parking themselves with Mr. Poilievre, and I think that to Cole's point, the Conservatives didn't think those numbers were real. Nobody thought they were real, and I think a bunch of them swooshed back over to the Liberals when they saw somebody new, and that group of people is still very fluid. So I think we're going to have a real race. I think there's going to be a real campaign. I think the more that Trump pushes beyond the realm of anything any of us thought possible in the last, 60 to 80 years, the less bandwidth Canadians will have to be able to kind of differentiate in those things, and the more they'll be looking for A, who can argue with Trump, and B, who will take care of them while things are going bad. So I think that's the place where all three of the leaders would be going in, and I think Jagmeet's trying to position himself there already now too. So I think a lot of that anti-Trudeau vote is very fluid, and I think that's why you're seeing the polls shift.
Okay, polls shift, and Susan's pointed out the fact that we're seeing different numbers, different firms. Let's bring in Polera right now, because they also had a poll out this week. They had Liberals, Conservatives in a tie, in particular when they factor in Mark Carney as the eventual leader of the Liberal race. But when they looked at why people are looking to the Liberals right now, 55% said it's because they feel worse about Pierre Poilievre now. And this is the quote from Polera. With the departure of Trudeau, voters are now focusing more on Poilievre, and strongly negative sentiment towards him is pushing votes to the Liberals, which was always the Liberal argument for Trudeau to stay. What do you make of that survey from Polera, Susan?
I think that's more where the Canadian sentiment is. Those numbers are going to continue to move around, but Pierre Poilievre has trouble presenting himself as a likable guy. He's the guy that's been telling the country for 2 years that Canada is broken, and now, as I've said before, he wants to be Captain Canada. And I think people know. They saw the apple eating, they saw the Canada is broken, they saw the T-shirts, and they saw him with the convoy. That's not the kind of leader the country is looking for. I think Canadians, in the face of absolute instability south of the border, they want steady stability, economic management. And that's why I think you see those numbers matching up. And the campaign will reveal the personalities of the two players. I think the debate will be fireworks on the Conservative side. It'll be low key on the Liberal side. And when Canadians go to the ballot, they'll say, who's best to steward us in this crazy time dealing with Donald Trump?
Okay, so you say Mark Carney is vulnerable. What about Pierre Poilievre if people have negative impressions of him?
Well, I look at the Ontario election that just happened, and in the most recent polling before the writ drop, Doug Ford, the negative impression of him was 45%, and he just won his third majority government. So I think people have a negative impression of you. Surprisingly, doesn't mean that they won't vote for you, which is interesting. But I look at some of these polls, the Polera poll, the Leger poll in particular, and I see there's a differentiation in terms of the regional breakdown. So in the Leger poll, for example, they had Carney-led Liberals leading by 50% in BC and 40% in Quebec. Those are higher than the Trudeau Liberal majority numbers in 2015, and I don't think people think those numbers bear out with political reality. After the French debate, given Mark Carney's performance, that number in Quebec dropped significantly, and subsequently afterwards, these numbers dropped in BC as well. So I think, week after week, we'll see a blip for Carney, but when it comes down to him actually being held accountable by the opposition and by many in the media in terms of squaring a lot of his comments, they're seeing some truths and some potential outright lies that are sinking his credibility in the media and with the general public.
That's hard to hear coming from Poilievre, who is known for stretching the truth on things. That I take exception to that. Carney has said the Conservatives are trying to stick things to him. He is not. He has probably could do a better job in answering some of the questions, but to declare an outright lie is false.
Well, perhaps he could be more precise.
Okay, George, to you.
Well, Poilievre's having a hard time putting the sheep's clothing on over himself as a wolf with his voting record that he's had, and his voting record right there for people to look at. But look, polls go up and polls go down, and I mean up is better, obviously, but I do think the one thing that Doug Ford had, though, is that people do see him as somebody kind of like them. And so whether they think the province was going the right direction or wrong direction, they felt like at least he was fighting for them. And I have to admit, and I think we've all admitted, that he's done a good job of speaking to Trump. And so I think that was something that Pierre Poilievre falls incredibly short on. And so I think, well, with the campaign goes forward, we're going to see the three main leaders trying to demonstrate that, one, they're just like the rest of us, and two, that they are the ones that can have our backs through this. And I think that I think Mark Carney's going to have a tough time with that, and I think Pierre Poilievre definitely will have a hard tough time.
Sorry, quickly out of time. I'm very sorry. But listen, we're going to talk a bit more about this weekend, because you're going to join me Sunday when we cover the Liberal leadership race, and then you can bring out the big gun, Susan.
Susan big guns. No big guns. Well, badminton racket, maybe.
George. There we go. Pickleball. Susan Cole George, thank you for that. Appreciate it. Oh, and congratulations on your local win. And that is our program for this Thursday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.